This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm.
And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett, and joining me today we have a blast from the past, someone that I hope all our listeners will be excited to see return to our airwaves or our podcasting waves after a lengthy gap, someone that is almost a treat for the listeners, I think, themselves. It's Tony Black. Hi Tony, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, Duncan. You've really bigged me up there. I don't know if I'm going to match up to this. It's very nice, though. That is very nice.
Well, it's always nice to, hark back to our past, to kind of reward the long-term listeners who've been following this show, right since the beginning. And it seemed appropriate because the subject that we're talking about in this episode is fan service. It's this idea of the things that creators, and we're, of course, talking about Star Trek, but we can discuss some other shows and even some films that are kind of out there at the moment making similar decisions maybe, but the kind of decisions that creators seem to make that seem very much geared towards pleasing a certain long-standing section of the viewers, I suppose we might say, and really what the kind of parameters of that phenomenon are, and I guess to what extent it's something that we're comfortable with, whether it's a good thing, whether it's creatively slightly limiting. I know you have some quite strong feelings about some of these issues. This episode kind of came out of a discussion we had on Twitter just after the end of season 2 of Discovery, and Tony had written a piece basically expressing, I think it's fair to say, some of your quite strong reservations about that particular season of Star Trek, which I have to say I sort of largely agreed with. I think I enjoyed season 2 of Discovery a lot more than you did, maybe, but the things that you picked out that you had a real problem with were things that have been kind of bothering me as well. And one of the things that's kind of really key to all that, I suppose, is this question of and it's inherent in the idea of doing a prequel series, but really it's this idea of, are decisions being made for kind of genuine creative reasons, or are there other sort of influences at work? And this idea of kind of fan service, like, we'll sort of throw this one for the fans, we'll do this and it will please the audience, constantly thinking about sort of pleasing, not necessarily even the whole audience, but a certain section of the audience. To me, I think that is a slightly problematic way to go about trying to create a new story.
Well, yeah, I mean, this, as you say, this came out of the back of a conversation off Discovery Season 2, and I would preface this by pointing anyone to my recent appearance on Standard Orbit, which with Zach Moore, which goes into detail about why I termed Season 2 of Discovery in some of my writing on my site, Cultural Conversation, as the original series Season 0.5. That was, and then Zach so named the podcast after that. And we had a really good discussion about it, which, as I say, has just come out on Trek FM. As we record, I don't know how far into the future this is going to be airing, but it's there. So a lot of my thoughts on this, I won't rehash too much in depth here, for want of belabouring this point. So if you really want to know more detail about that, go and listen to TOS Season 0.5 on Standard Orbit. But what I talk about really on there is, certainly in relation to Star Trek, is the idea that fan service in terms of the franchise right now is very much in line with a lot of different major IPs and franchises, in that it's brewed up heavily with a lot of nostalgia. And Discovery was sort of built on that. Discovery is a prequel series set in the original series era. And my issue with it, season 2 anyway, was that it didn't feel like a prequel series as opposed to a prequel series for the original series. And it became too much about characters who aren't the Discovery crew, and too much about fans being able to see Spock when he's young, or, oh, there's Captain Pike. Oh, wow, it's number 1. The Enterprise, the original Enterprise, which is all wonderful in its own way, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a bit of an excitement when these things were announced, or when, you saw the Enterprise for the first time. But very quickly, you realise in that season that it isn't necessarily working to the show's best interests. And my concern with fan service, and I've written about this a fair bit, is that the nostalgic element only ever gets you so far with creativity. It very easily slips into repetitiveness. It can lead to, unless you're very, very careful with how you do it, it can lead to fatigue. And I've really felt fatigue in season 2 of Discovery. I felt it in the storytelling. I felt it in the plotting. I felt it in the writing, and for the second season of a new show, which is attempting to be something for a new, era of television, it really worried me, because the edge and the sort of unusual dynamism that was in the first series of Discovery, which is flawed, but it's a bit of a rough diamond. It's trying to chart new directions and push the franchise a bit. That's all gone in season 2. And my worry is that if you keep going down that kind of road, then you end up with something that in 50 years, and this is something I make the point of in the other podcast, you will end up in something in 50 years that people won't be looking back on like they look back on the original series now. You won't have that nostalgia in some respects, because it's like we're eating our own tail. So fan service for me is dangerous waters, and it's happening not just in Star Trek, but in lots of other different major franchises right now.
Well, and we've seen recently, the kind of darker side of that is these fan petitions. And obviously, this is not to say that fans should not be kind of invested in the properties that they're interested in. Star Trek was saved originally by fans, essentially by a fan petition, but that was a fan petition saying, we want more Star Trek. And in fact, this season 3 of the original series that they got was maybe not quite, many people would say is, I think probably everyone would say, is the least successful season of the original series. So in that sense, what they got maybe wasn't quite what they've been asking for, but it was at least a positive gesture in that instance. The fans were saying, we love this show, we want more of it, we don't want this show to die, and really made history, and certainly put us in this position where we can be discussing the merits or demerits of season 2 of Discovery. But these days we're seeing increasingly, whenever something comes out that the fans of a particular property aren't happy about, there's immediately a petition. Game of Thrones, we've just had, gathering vast numbers of signatures saying basically, we're not happy with how this all worked out. We want you to go away and do it again. If that was an option for Star Trek, I think there were quite a few episodes I'd certainly be signing These Are The Voyages. Talking about fan service, that was supposedly a valentine to the fans, which in the end turned out to be more like a kind of card from a stalker that nobody wanted, really. So there is that potential to, really get your fan service wrong. And I suppose that's part of it. You and I are both long-term fans of Star Trek. There are, we'll talk about maybe examples that do work for us better. For me, something like Trials and Tribble-ations is a wonderful episode. I love that episode. But I think for me, maybe I still hold fan service episodes and fan service decisions to a high creative standard. I don't think it just gives you a pass. I feel there's this sort of idea sometimes that maybe if you kind of, you wave an Andorian at someone, or you kind of, you gesture towards the fans by saying, look, we know about this thing that we know that you love, that somehow that's enough. And it's almost like, when, sometimes really bad comedians make jokes that are, you can see why they're sort of technically a joke, but they're not actually funny because they've not gone the next step of thinking, how do I genuinely make this work? How do I make it land? And for me, sometimes there's a feeling that fan service can feel, when it doesn't work, it feels a bit cheap, and I feel slightly patronized by it. I think that's the thing, is it feels like it's sort of saying, here, look, this is this thing you love, love it. And my reaction is a bit like, well, no, come on, you know, there's a reason why I love this thing, and it's, you know, it's a bit more. You've got to try a little bit harder than that somehow.
Yeah. There was a very funny tweet I saw in the wake of Game of Thrones, the finale, which was the final, just before the Game of Thrones finale, I should say, which was a tweet somebody had said, the final episode of Game of Thrones will be Riker and Troi on the holodeck explaining the history of Westeros, which I thought was great. But it's just to go back to that very briefly, because it's an interesting parallel to sort of make, in that I'm a really big fan of that show, and obviously anyone who listens to this, even if you're not a fan of Game of Thrones or you've never watched it, you will have more than likely heard about how the ending has really polarized people, you know, and that was always going to happen. This is the ending of the biggest show of this decade, at least. Is possibly the biggest TV show in the history of television in many ways. So it was always going to polarize. It was always going to happen. But what you found is that you have a lot of fans who are very, very frustrated that the storyline has gone in a direction they didn't anticipate. Now, I consider myself one of these big fans, but I've tried where possible to have some sort of measured distance about what I'm watching, in that when I'm watching these last few episodes, I can see that there are certain elements that don't play out as you might expect. And the key thing with Game of Thrones is that it's always been a show where, for many seasons, partly because it's based on a book series, but partly because of the way the story is told, you kind of always have had an idea that it's going to get to a certain point with a certain group of people for a certain reason. And that it's a show built on expectation. It's not like something like Lost or Westworld, or even Discovery Season 2, where you don't quite know where the mystery is going. You know, Game of Thrones is very much that you know where it's ultimately supposed to get to. And then when it gets there, recently, it didn't quite do what you thought it would do. And I think you found a lot of fans who are really invested in that show, and I consider myself one of them. In a way, many people are invested in Discovery already, which is fantastic. But I think a lot of fans are at a point where they expect a TV show or a movie or a franchise to give them what they want, and to give them the conclusion they want, or the character beats they want, or the very specific vision of what they have in their head, as opposed to how they think something should end. And I think a big concern with fan service in that respect is that it leads to a lot of frustration when people aren't quite given what they get. And I think there's a difference between servicing fans in that respect and the expectation of what you should get, as opposed to what are effectively gimmick episodes of television, the kind of things you've been talking about. These are the Voyages in Star Trek's, reference. Trials and Tribble-ations. These are episodes which are designed to serve as almost a love letter, be it successful or not, to the past, to different characters, to certain situations. I think there's a big difference in terms of fans and what they get out of that, and what they should expect from that kind of television, as opposed to how fans might feel that they are not being properly serviced with the ending of a particular story, or something that they've invested heavily in. And, you know, maybe this is my problem with Discovery Season 2. Maybe I wanted something out of that season that is different from what they gave us. And maybe that's one of the reasons I'm one of the most vocal, voices with misgivings about this. Maybe I put too much stock in it being something else. So, you know, you
should start a petition, Tony.
I'll petition against myself.
Get them to rewrite it, you know.
yeah. Rewrite the last season. Or a petition to stop me podcasting again about it, maybe.
Yeah. Although the ironic thing is, in some ways, you could say, it's not the results of a petition, obviously, but like this whole decision to send Discovery 950 years in the future is almost as much as in some ways that escapes all of this stuff, and it means that they can't really lean so heavily on the kind of prequel thing and on the kind of TOS thing and everything, it is also in its own way a kind of course correction based partly on people like us criticizing the show. Do you know what I mean? So many of the creative decisions that came out of that season, I think this is, you know, probably one of the reasons that people like you, and to a lesser extent me, had problems with it, feel like they're course correcting. You know, even things like, and I know maybe this isn't the case, we don't really know with Culber, did they really have it all worked out how it was all going to go? But it does sort of feel, maybe even if that arc was planned in its entirety from the get-go, the way that it kind of played out and the kind of, and certainly the way that the show talked about it, the fact that they had to go online immediately and say, oh, he's coming back, the fact that they had to kind of hedge all of this stuff was very much like an engagement with the audience, which is almost coming out of a kind of place of fear of the audience getting angry about something. Whereas, I mean, I don't watch Game of Thrones, but obviously I've been following, because it's kind of inescapable, the sort of discussion around it. It seems like, I mean, and I think this is quite a brave decision, the writers of Game of Thrones seem to have a kind of healthy contempt for their audience's expectations and basically just say, look, this is what we're doing, you know, and, you know, like it or suck it up or, you know, or leave
basically,
it kind of thing. And I think that in some ways I had issues with season 1 of Discovery. I enjoyed it more on a binge watch, and I haven't gone back and rewatched season 2, and I may enjoy that more on a binge watch as well. But I think I can certainly see what you mean, that season 1 felt like a weird, quirky, strange thing that's its own thing. And I think Disco still has a lot of that. But the things that I wasn't so wild about were the things where it felt, I suppose it's kind of pandering in a way. And I don't know about you. I mean, when we got to the end of season 1 and that final shot of the last episode, which I have to say was spoiled for me by someone on Twitter, so I didn't get the experience that I was supposed to have of being like, you know, caught off guard by it. But I think even if I hadn't been expecting it, you see, my reaction watching that was not one of, oh wow, how exciting, it's the Enterprise, I love Star Trek, I love to see the Enterprise. You know, I've seen the Enterprise. I feel like that's not why I was watching. I wasn't watching Discovery hoping the Enterprise would turn up. And it's a bit like, hopefully no one was watching Next Gen waiting for, you know, McCoy or Spock or Scotty to turn up. You know, that's not to say that those things didn't work when those things happened, but hopefully that's not why you're watching it. And I suppose when I watched that last episode of season 1 of Discovery, that last minute or whatever it is, my feeling was more anxiety. It was more sort of dread. It was more like, oh gosh, you know, where is this going? Because I felt that they would screw it up. And I don't actually think they did screw it up. I mean, I think aside from, you know, I have reservations, as I say, about season 2, but I don't think they screwed up bringing in the Enterprise necessarily. I still don't think it was necessarily the right decision for the show. But to be honest, my thought at the end of that first season was, well, it's probably just a tease. We'll probably see them for 5 minutes. They'll go on their way and that'll be it. And Disco will get back to being Disco. And it's kind of just, you know, a bit like one of those, you know, often you get with old shows, the cliffhanger that doesn't really go anywhere. Or to be honest, even the best of both worlds, the cliffhanger, you know, Mr. Worf, fire. Oh, it doesn't work. It's that kind of, you know, sort of classic thing of, okay, you're going to tease something and really build up expectations and then just move on extremely quickly and kind of almost forget that happened. But then of course, what we got was very different. I mean, I'm curious, when you watched that last episode of season 1 and you saw that final minute or two, what were your feelings about going into season 2? What were you know, because this was before we heard, oh, Captain Pike's going to be captaining Discovery, before we heard, oh, they've cast number 1, they cast Spock even. But just from that tease, because that was the biggest piece of fan service in season 1, I suppose, of Discovery, which has plenty of kind of little nuggets and Easter eggs and so on in there. But that was the kind of real, and again, what it felt like to me was that was kind of someone saying, look at this massive bunch of flowers we've got you. Isn't it beautiful? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I was a bit like, well, yeah, it is. But, you know, is that what I thought was going on here? You know?
I think, well, I mean, the thing is, I mean, if you look at season 1, the very construction of Discovery in itself is kind of fan service. The whole thing, you know, you might say, oh, well, you know, we've had a prequel series before, which was Enterprise, and there were definitely aspects of Enterprise, we may well talk about this later, but there are aspects of Enterprise that are definitely fan service later, you know, but the concept of Enterprise was more about establishing a prequel, you know, setting to the whole of the Star Trek journey. It was a different kind of prequel. This is a prequel designed purely to tap into the kind of nostalgia that J.J. Abrams revived with the movies. You know, he went back with those movies as a way, you know, and Star Trek was dead on television. Nobody was watching it. It was a new era. He revived interest in Star Trek in the cinematic level by bringing back Kirk, by bringing back Spock, by doing a replay of some of these old, you know, classic movie plot lines, etc., etc. And so when Brian Fuller gets the green light, Alex Kurtzman get the green light to make a Star Trek show. They make something that is, and there were a lot of different plans with Discovery. Originally, how it was supposed to be set in different eras of the Star Trek universe, which I think is a massive missed opportunity, quite honestly, but that's a separate thing. They kind of are doing that now with the expanded CBS universe, which is fine. But the very concept of Discovery is a prequel series set in an era in which, let's face it, when you first heard that Discovery was set 10 years before the original series, even before finding out that Berman was going to be a daughter of Sarek, did anyone not think, oh, well, we're going to see Kirk, or we're going to see Spock, or we're going to see Scotty, or somebody, or something to do with that original? Why set it there unless you were going to make it in some way tie into the original series? You were going to try and tap into the nostalgic aspect of that show, of that era. Yes, they updated it visually, aesthetically, but, it's still that first season, much as it is trying new things and it's doing some things that do work and don't work, like the spore drive, which is a terrible idea, but that doesn't exist now. Shh. We're not allowed to talk about that. But it's trying new things. But the point is that the very concept in itself, even before you get to season 2, is fan service. But what season 1 tried to do within that was tell some stories which did try and do different things. So when you get the Enterprise at the end, I won't lie, Duncan, I was quite excited, but I think it was more a case of, ooh, okay. And then immediately in my head I went, ooh, that probably means we might see Pike. And I did. And admittedly at first I was a little bit excited by it, and I was like, oh, this is cool. This is interesting. However, I didn't expect, quite honestly, an entire season built around that. And I think that's where, if you'd had the first 2, I think Zach and I said this on Standard Orbit, but if you had 2 episodes at the start of the season that maybe had the Enterprise crew and dealt with some of that, and then they go off on their own separate ways, fine. Okay, fine. That's a different kind of thing. But I think there is, I can totally see where you're coming from in terms of an element of dread about it, because that's the point where Discovery really stops being Discovery, and it does start from that point on being the original series with a little bit of Discovery in it. And I think, and it's really surprised me, or maybe I'm naive and maybe this shouldn't surprise me at all, but it has really surprised me how many fans don't have a problem with that. How many fans actually are perfectly happy for, Pike, Spock, number 1 to, elbow their way in past all the new characters that we'd created and essentially just make it about them, and it really surprises me, because it's one of those things where, imagine if that had have happened in the Next Generation in season 2, that suddenly you'd had, an older Spock turn up and you'd had Scotty come through his Dyson sphere or whatever, and then old McCoy's rattling around and they take over and they're basically the front.
They come to hijack the Enterprise.
They come to hijack the Enterprise, yeah. And Spock goes, yeah, Spock goes, we're going to recover Captain Kirk from the Nexus or whatever, and imagine that. Imagine if it becomes that. I mean, you'd be watching it thinking, what is going on? What about the new characters? What about Riker? What about Troi? What about, and if that had happened, those characters, the characters that we do love from the Next Generation, Data, Picard, all these people, they would never have had a chance to become these classic, immortalized characters in the Star Trek universe that they were. And you think, well, it's not to say that the damage has been irreparably done with Discovery, because season 3 might actually repair a lot of this damage. But you had a season where the main characters on a TV show have had to essentially, fight their way for screen time. And I think that's fundamentally a flawed idea. And it's a cynical one, because I'm trying not to go over too heavily on what I said on Standard Orbit, but ultimately I think it's a cynical move to try and get fans in, new and old fans, on the basis of Spock, of Pike, of the Enterprise. And I've got a very cynical raised eyebrow about the decision making behind that for season 2. Because I think they got to the end of season 1 of Discovery, and I think they were worried that they were going to start hemorrhaging fans because it wasn't what they considered was, quote unquote, Star Trek. And I think if we get to a point where fans are starting to want exactly the same thing over and over again, we're in trouble.
Definitely. And I mean, I would say, for what it's worth, I loved Anson Mount. I thought he was great. I understand why people thought he's very charming, quite different to Jeffrey Hunter in a way, but, you know, fair enough. I love that character. I really enjoyed Pike as the captain. I didn't have a problem with Ethan Peck and his Spock. I thought that was fine. But things like, I suppose for me, it was the I don't know how many episodes. It was probably like 6 or 7. It was like a good third of the season, I'd say, wasn't it? Where they were searching this search for Spock, basically. And Spock was the kind of MacGuffin, of the series. And it's this kind of building up this kind of mystery around it. And also like something like Pike. Okay, fine. Pike. Interesting character. Good captain. They found some ways to kind of add some nuance to his character. This idea that he maybe has this, sort of semi-religious background. That's an interesting sort of take on the character, given what we saw in the cage. They've given him a little bit of depth. What I felt is the problem with Pike, though, of course, is he is a character where you know where he's going. This is always the problem with the prequel. So there's a kind of, he's dramatically a dead character in a sense, in that he's, you know, almost literally a dead character because we know his end point. I know he's not actually dead, but, then the kind of attempts to slot into that, I don't know, like this whole thing about him choosing to take the crystal, for me, that didn't work. I can see some people loved that. They thought that made him more heroic. They thought that made his story more tragic or whatever. For me, it just felt like a way of trying to introduce a kind of dramatic beat into a story that is essentially dead because we already know the outcome of it, if you know what I mean, by adding something surprising. On the other hand, you know, I loved Lethe, and you could say the same is sort of true about that, in that it's kind of introducing a moment within the story that explains what we know happens later. For me, that worked much more successfully. That was a much more kind of nuanced, complex, take on it. Whereas the stuff in season 2 of Discovery, you know, going back to Talos 4, I didn't hate any of these episodes in their own right necessarily, but I didn't feel that they added very much. And I absolutely think you're right that there's an element of kind of hijacking the story that the show is sort of supposedly about with that stuff, because that became such a sort of, a big part of that season in a way. And it's also maybe a difference. I mean, you were talking about like these special shows, these anniversary shows or whatever. I mean, yeah, we had, you know, for the 30th anniversary, DS9 and Voyager both did a sort of nostalgia fest show one way or another. I mean, I think most people would agree one of those shows did it more successfully than the other. Not to say that Flashback is a terrible episode, but I think it shows. And when you were talking about this idea of, you know, the Valentine to the fans or whatever it is, I think that who is writing that love letter, whatever the metaphor is, makes a big difference. And I think it's not a surprise that the DS9 writers writing a love letter to the original series hit all the right kind of emotional beats as well as the kind of comedic beats. And Brannon Braga, who we know, you know, admitted he never watched the original series, ends up doing it for Voyager. And it, you know, okay, it's fine, but it doesn't have that kind of, meaning to it. Do you know what I mean? And I think that maybe and then Brannon Braga again has to write this, you know, these are the Voyages, sort of trying to do the same thing in a weird way. I mean, in a different way, but sort of trying to hit one of these kind of, sort of special fan servicey episodes. And again, it falls completely flat. And admittedly, that was not about the original series. That was kind of about Next Gen, and he was around for Next Gen. And so he probably did have nostalgic feelings himself about Next Gen. But again, that kind of, I guess what happened in that instance is what I think is always the danger of these stories, is that the fan service element sells short what else is actually going on. Sort of, so in the case of Enterprise, what that episode did, and this was why, you know, that you can see Scott Bakula talking about it on the Blu-rays, and Scott Bakula seemingly is like the nicest guy you could imagine. And he basically said in this instance, he was the one picking up the phone and saying, you know, what the F is this? This is, you know, he was angry about it, justifiably, because I think that maybe that episode came out of, you know, Brannon Braga and Rick Berman has had a bad experience with Enterprise. I think, you know, they'd kind of been pushed out on the writing front. You'd had this 4th season that Manny Koto organised, which was much more successful in many ways. I mean, personally, my favourite season of Enterprise is the 3rd one, but most fans, I think, love the 4th one, which does do all the kind of fan service in various different ways. Some of them more successful than others, I would say. And then they came back to write this final episode, which I think they'd kind of basically written beforehand anyway. But what it does is it kind of almost underestimates the extent to which there were fans of Enterprise. You know, not everyone hated that show. And I suppose it's that kind of tendency of the course correction, or the kind of feeling this anxiety, the fans don't like something, so we'd better change it. And it's almost like by saying, well, what the fans really liked was Next Gen. That was, you know, Brannon Braga's probably sitting there thinking, I remember once upon a time, I worked on a Star Trek show that everyone loved. And since then, you know, he'd been working on Voyager, which people had kind of mixed feelings about. He did Enterprise, which is his big show, which a lot of people had mixed feelings about. It must have felt like they could never quite get it right again. And therefore the solution is to go back to the one that everyone loved. But it just totally sort of misses the point. That's why I sort of say it's like the stalker turning up. It's like it doesn't get what you want somehow. And obviously some of these things are subjective, because some people, a lot of the things that you and I are saying that we don't really want, other people are saying, oh, I love it. I can't believe they went back to Telos 4. I can't believe, you know, I love what's going on with Captain Pike. I think his arc's so tragic and beautiful and all this stuff. You know, they love all of that. It's
because it's plugging gaps. I mean, I wrote a piece on this. I talked on the podcast. I've written about the fact that season 2 of Discovery is like season 4 of Enterprise, essentially fan fiction. It's fan fiction that's been filmed. It's fan fiction that's been given a budget and it's been allowed to you know, the whole thing about Pike, which I agree with you, I think is really misjudged in terms of that. The whole thing with Pike is that he was a fairly big character in the, you know, the historical sort of lexicon of Star Trek, who nobody knew enough about, you know, and it was one of those things. Over the years, you've had tons of tie-in fiction, tons of, you know, fan fiction writing Pike's adventures, Pike's stories, you know, that mission of the Enterprise, you know, the crew of the Cage. And it felt like when they realized that they were in that era, you know, that was one thing they were like, oh, we've got to do that. We've got to fill that in. We've got to explain what all that is, because that's what fan fiction does. It explains, it plugs gaps, it writes things. That's what season 4 of Enterprise was all about. You know, you had the guy who invented the transporter. You know, you had the history of the Vulcans. You had the Surak and all that stuff. You had Arik Sung and the eugenics and all the tie into Wrath of Khan. All of that was the kind of stuff you would see fan fiction writers writing, and they did it because Enterprise was you know, like Discovery, a show which could never find itself, you know, and this is what I worry about with Discovery, and that it's going to go a similar way. Enterprise never really figured out what it was. At the first 2 seasons, it was trying to be Next Generation, but set like 200 years previously, and it was just very rote and dull and everything like that. And then at the same time, it had this massive sort of temporal Cold War plotline, which sort of jarred with all that. I agree with you. Season 3 is the most consistent because it does a 9/11 analogy, you know, all the way through it. And we've talked about this on this show before, haven't we? We talked, you know, in an earlier episode. And it's the most consistent season. But then it lurches into this fan fiction when the ratings are starting to plummet. They're starting to worry that it's not going to last 7 seasons like the rest of them. And by then it's too little too late, you know. And so that's what these kind of stories do. And I think that's the difference between what the anniversary episodes that certainly did, in the sense that they were tying into an era of Star Trek and trying to look back 30 years on at, you know, what this franchise has become. And Trials and Tribble-ations does that really well because it manages to go back to the crew and find a really inventive way and fun way of integrating the Deep Space Nine characters in, you know, and it's very silly, you know, but it knows how silly it is. It has fun with the material, you know, it's giving you lots of joy, and it certainly is never going to make that anything more than a fun little throwaway gimmick episode. You know, next week it's back in the 24th century. It's back onto the plot lines. You know, I think the week after it might be The Begotten or something like that, or you know, something that's very rooted in the stories and the mythology of Deep Space Nine. That's done and it's gone. Even Flashback, which is less successful, because quite frankly, Braga's ideas about doing this are quite weird. You know, he just basically saw, oh yeah, Tim Russ was in The Undiscovered Country. Let's make him Tuvok. Oh, let's find it.
He was in the wrong film, though. Tim Russ was in Generations, wasn't he?
Oh, yes, he was.
But you're right. There might be, I mean, like, unconsciously, maybe that's part of what was going on. And of course, there was also this thing with Braga, that Braga was the one, not on his own, admittedly, but, you know, Braga was the guy who'd never watched the original series, who got to kill Captain Kirk. You know, there's that kind of weird, I do still wonder whether Generations is a kind of bridge I mean, obviously it's a bridge. There's several bridges in that film. One of them, a fatal bridge. But I don't know. I sort of wonder what the role of that is, because I mean, we don't think of Generations as, or I didn't sort of think of Generations as this kind of fan service thing. But one of the things I've been watching a lot recently for a future episode of Primitive Culture is a lot of Doctor Who. And Doctor Who, they do all the, the 2 doctors, the 5 doctors, they do all the stuff where you get the doctors together through various, kind of timey-wimey means. Generations, of course, that was the big gimmick, 2 captains. We got the 2 captains together. And we're going to find a way of kind of making them work together. And that is the ultimate fan service on one level. But at the same time, I don't know why, it doesn't feel, and I'm not saying this is a good thing about that film or a bad thing or what, but I don't know, it literally hadn't occurred to me until now that might be on the list of things to discuss. And I'm not quite sure why that is, but I do think one of the reservations that a lot of people have about that film may be partly to do with the fact that, again, it's Brannon Braga, though also Ron Moore, who I think was, more of a original series fan. It's the kind of new Trek writers having to deal with the old Trek and the new Trek and trying to sort of bridge those 2 things. And it's always tricky to work out how to do it, I suppose, however you do it. And it's cheesy. I mean, even like in DS9, which does it beautifully, it's cheesy and silly, but they kind of just acknowledge that it's cheesy and silly. There's an orb, it's magic, whatever. And it's kind of all quite fun. It doesn't really matter that it's a ludicrous story. And it's even, you've got, at the end, in that episode, you've got the Mulder and Scully characters kind of, again, a sort of other level of like, of kind of jokey, I mean, we did
meta-textual
looking at Easter eggs. Yeah. I mean, exactly that kind of meta kind of Easter egg thing. But I think the thing is, you can do the meta stuff, but you have to kind of recognize the meta stuff is fun. That's like the sugar on top. Do you know what I mean? That's the kind of confection side of it. There's got to be something else going on as well. So even in Trials and Tribble-ations, there's a lot of humour. It's very funny. There's sort of character comedy and everything, but it's got the kind of sweet moments. It's got even, Sisko getting Kirk's autograph, whatever, which is a kind of meta moment, because obviously we know that we're thinking about like Star Trek fans getting William Shatner's autograph or whatever, but it has a kind of heart to it that I think is genuine and is heartfelt, and it comes from that real kind of love. But what I think about these kind of meta moments, which are almost like sort of breaking the fourth wall in a way, and it's not that I think they can't work necessarily, but I think sometimes there's a sort of misjudgment around them. And one of the things just going back to Discovery that bothered me slightly, and this is a tiny, tiny thing, but at the end of that last episode, they made a big thing about Spock shaving his beard, because he had this sort of moment where he's like stroking his beard and thinking, shall I shave my beard? As if Spock is sort of thinking, shall I go and turn myself into what people think Spock is supposed to look like? And it just seemed like, and it's this kind of, it's a beat. It's like a dramatic beat in the show. And I just feel like when you were talking about fan fiction, it really makes me think of that, because that's, okay, Spock having a beard or not having a beard is something that is meaningful in the kind of meta universe around Star Trek. Do you know what I mean? To the fans, something like that is meaningful. Oh, Spock's got a beard. He looks different. We can debate on Twitter whether having the beard works or not. Within the universe of Star Trek, Spock having a beard is not interesting or dramatic, or it's trivial. It's as trivial as anyone else having a beard is in real life and deciding to shave their beard. And by like making that a dramatic beat and putting the music under it and kind of having the stroking the chin and doing all that stuff, to me, it's like it's confusing the two things. And I think one of my reservations about a lot of this stuff and a lot of this, and I do sort of wonder, you were talking about J.J. Abrams. I mean, Alex Kurtzman, of course, is a big sort of figure in this. Why is it that, to me, Ira Stephen Bear's idea of a love letter, like, moves me? I'd go on the date with Ira Stephen Bear if he was the one sending the card, if you know what I mean. Brannon Braga seems slightly clumsy. Alex Kurtzman's or JJ's or whatever, again, I sort of feel like, to me, is slightly missing something. And that whole thing with the beard is like, it's a tiny thing, but it's a kind of a microcosm of something, I think, because it's almost like it confuses the one level of reality for the other. Do you know what I mean? And it's almost as if it's saying, okay, as fans, you're so wrapped up in this and you're so absorbed in it that you almost can't distinguish between what is actually part of the story and what is part of your kind of meta story. And that's not to say that can't work. I mean, I think in Star Trek V, that line, not in front of the Klingons, that's a similar moment insofar as that is a kind of acknowledgement of the existence of slash fiction and this kind of idea of, this kind of something that exists outside of the kind of, reality of, of the Federation and of Starfleet and of Star Trek in that sense. But it's a throwaway gag. It's a joke. It's not supposed to carry any kind of weight. And I think I suppose it's just this question again and again of kind of hitting it right, of hitting that kind of balance. And it is a bit like a sort of sense of humor or something, and having the right kind of nuance to that. And I think it's quite difficult. But if you want to connect with someone on that level, if you want to connect with a fan, you want to offer them something special and you want to kind of give them something like that, it has to come from a place of empathy, I suppose, between you and them. Do you know what I mean? Like you have to genuinely love the same things they love, or you have to kind of feel or appreciate the same things that they do. And I mean, maybe I'm talking nonsense, because obviously a lot of, the people who love these things are big Star Trek fans and it worked for them, and the things that don't work for you or me clearly do work for other people. But to me, it feels like they're sort of, like I said before, it can be a bit cheap. It can feel a bit like it's not very genuine. And what it makes me wonder, and I hesitate to say this because I don't want to feel, I have a lot of issues around gatekeeping and kind of people saying that people are fake fans or whatever. And I would never want to be the one, accusing someone of being a fake fan or saying, your approach to fandom is wrong or whatever it is. But I do worry in some ways that as much as I have reservations about Brannon Braga and some of the stuff that he wrote trying to kind of fill these gaps as we talked about, I appreciate the fact that Braga was honest in saying, I'm not an original series fan. I never really watched the original series. It's not my thing. I don't know about that. It doesn't mean anything to me. I feel like these days no one would be allowed to say that. And I feel that there's a sort of expectation that even all the actors and everyone has to pretend that they grew up loving Star Trek and it really means a lot to them. And, I hope it did. And that's lovely. And, and a lot of them have, Anthony Rapp, for example, has gone away and watched loads of Star Trek and clearly does really love it. And I think a lot of them do. But I just feel like there's a sort of 20 years ago, most people didn't grow up loving Star Trek. Maybe that's changed and that's great and everyone does. But I sort of feel it's the flip side of that thing of like, being a nerd becoming cool. And we had Barack Obama, the president, who was a bit of a nerd and liked some of the sci-fi things and so on. But it's almost like it's gone from it being acceptable to say that you loved something like that to feeling like that it's almost not allowed to say that it passed you by or you weren't that interested in it, or actually it doesn't mean that much to you, or you don't understand. Someone like Patrick Stewart, who would probably say, to be honest, I had no idea what was going on half the time. Do you know what I mean? That kind of, or like Kate Mulgrew saying, I didn't understand any of it. All this science was just gibberish to me, but, I read the scripts and I did my best with the character and I, tried to get into it. I feel like there's almost this expectation these days that everyone has to be a fan as well as part of the creation of it. And I think that's slightly problematic for me. And so this idea that like it's fans speaking to fans, well, I don't want to say they're not fans. Maybe they are fans. Maybe they love it and so on. And some of them I think genuinely do, but I feel that it worries me that I feel there's this expectation that everyone has to kind of claim that somehow. And I don't think it's honest.
I think a lot of it as well goes back down to the fact that you are the line between fans and the creators and the actors of these things has really sort of disappeared now. I mean, I mentioned it again on Standard Orbit about how I got into a little bit of a heated, brief exchange with Wilson Cruz on Twitter because I'd replied to Brandon Nutella making a comment about whether Culber should have stayed dead as a character, and I said, yeah, he should. And then Wilson Cruz went, oh, that's not very nice. And then I had to explain to him, it's not a reflection on you as an actor or you as a character. It was just, I think it was the wrong choice. But it's that whole thing of, well, now, back in the day, could you even imagine when we were watching Voyager, DS9, Next Generation, can you imagine actually having a conversation with like Jonathan Frakes on Twitter about the episode that's just aired? I mean, it was beyond the realms of even thinking of a possibility. It really is. But now you can hop on, you can tweet Anthony Rapp, and there's a good chance he might get back to you. And so I think, and that's not to say that's not a good thing, because I think, like you say, I actually think the Discovery crew and the actors are lovely, you know, and we've seen them live, we've seen them on a stage, haven't we? We've asked them questions, you know, at DST and things like that, and they're genuinely lovely people, and you really get the sense they love what they do, and they
wonderful. Work really hard, and they also do a really good job. I think
they do. They do a great job,
talented and very, you know, dedicated as well.
They are, and they're lovely. I really like them. I think they're one of the nicest collection of people involved in a something like this I've ever come across. They're great, but it's fans these days really do have, not all of them, and I'm not generalising. I'm trying not to generalise here, but there is and this is not just a Star Trek phenomenon. This is everywhere. This is Game of Thrones. This is Star Wars. This is James Bond. Everything, every single thing you could imagine. Fans have a sense of real entitlement about what they think they should be given, what they're expecting, and you know, they feel like they have a right to voice this directly to the people. I mean, right now you're seeing, you know, these, you mentioned it earlier about the petitions to remake the entire 8th season of Game of Thrones. And I think it was Sophie Turner, who plays Sansa in the show, came out and said, that's just really disrespectful. You know, we've worked really hard for a year to create this, and you're turning around and like a million of you are writing a petition going, oh, you must remake it. It wasn't what we wanted. It's like, well, when did we get to a point where what we are creatively given, for better or worse, we have a right to judge whether it exists or not? You know, when did we get there? Because that's not how art works. I may not like a lot of the choices that Alex Kurtzman and his group did in season 2 of Discovery, but I would never in a million years think of tweeting them to say, your show stinks, I hate it, you're terrible, you've done awful things, how dare you. One thing, it's rude, and the other thing is they are making what they wanted to make, for better or worse. I may not agree with the decisions they made, but they made what they wanted to make for whatever reason. And regardless of my feelings about the quality, and equally as a fan, I am more than within my rights to voice that. I'm more than within my rights to write about it, to podcast about it, to talk about it and say, this didn't work, this is why I think that. But equally, creators and writers and stars have more than the right to do what they think they should do, you know. And this is what, you know, when you look at things, and there are some weird decisions. I mean, you know, these Are The Voyages is hard to defend on any level, because it's just bizarre. It's just one of the most bizarre things you'll ever see. But, you know, they did what they thought was an interesting, innovative, unique, you know, ending to Enterprise that catastrophically failed. You know, and I think you've got to respect on some level what they wanted to do, even if it didn't remotely work, and it is awful. You know, and that's
they
that's
followed
the thing.
Through with their truly terrible idea.
They did, and, you know, and this is the thing. And I think on some level, you people should stop and remember that we're not entitled to anything. You know, we're not, as fans, we're not. This isn't about us getting what we want all the time. This is about us getting what, you know, what people who make these things, who are in the position where they've got the money or the liberty or, you know, the expertise to make things, even if it's things based on a franchise we've loved for 50 years, that we obsessively follow, that we want to see work, that we want the details to line up, you know, even if it's that, then we should respect it. We should respect the effort. We should respect what they want to try and do. And I think, and this is happening, you know, it was particularly pervasive with The Last Jedi in Star Wars, you know, with the terrible, terrible treatment of certain of the characters and some of the, you know, and sometimes some of the actors are complicit in it, you know, so they are. So on some level, sometimes they tweet things out, or, you know, I mean, you have to look at the X-Files and how in the last season of that, Gillian Anderson was quite vocal, or with a lot of shade on Twitter, as to how that all ended, you know? So, you know, they can sometimes stir the pot a little bit, but ultimately, I think the boundary between fan and creator has grown worryingly thin. And I think that, you know, it's partly the social media revolution, you know, that has created this. We didn't have the tools when, in the 90s, when, you know, or even when These Are The Voyages came out, there were probably a lot of strong letters, but this was pre-Facebook, this was pre-Twitter. People couldn't directly message Brannon Braga and go, I hate you, you know. You might be able to email them, but it was different. It was in more of a condensed sort of, pathway. Whereas now, it is quite a toxic vacuum, and it's led to a lot of partisanship. You've got haters and likers, or you've got a very clear dividing line in a lot of ways between the two. To the point, like you say, people are afraid to voice a contrary opinion, or people believe they've got to line up and back it. They've got to be the one saying, "Oh yeah, of course I know that episode from 1992." It's like, you don't. You probably don't, and it's okay if you don't. So I think we've reached a bit of a worrying stage.
Just because we're fans, we can't expect everyone to be fans the same way that we are. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of, this could almost be a whole other discussion, but that famous Saturday Night Live sketch with William Shatner, the kind of Get a Life sketch, which was all very much predicated on that idea of, do you remember in episode 27 when this happened? Exactly those kind of questions, which you do still sometimes get at conventions. But I think hopefully most fans are a bit more aware in terms of kind of trying to bridge that gap if they're going to interact with the creators or interact with the actors or whatever, and recognize that, yes, they might do the conventions every year or whatever, but you're asking them to talk about things that they maybe did 20 or 30 or, 50 years ago. And you have to be kind of realistic about what you kind of expect people to remember, or what you expect them to talk about. But one of the things that struck me from what you were just saying, and maybe we should just talk a little bit about, what does this idea of service mean? One of the reasons I've always been slightly uncomfortable with the concept of fan service, or the phrase fan service, is, to me, it sounds very sleazy. It always conjures to my mind some image of like dodgy massage parlours or something. It's the kind of
a Ryzen bordello.
Yeah, exactly. It's something kind of, it's like something extra that is a little bit, I don't know, there's something sort of almost inappropriate about it. And it reminds me very much of this phrase that Brannon Braga actually used to use when he was writing Enterprise, continuity pornographers. And that's what he used to say. I mean, actually, although he wasn't on Twitter interacting with them, they did get a lot of complaint letters. They did get a lot of people objecting to various things they were doing. And he used to say that he felt the continuity pornographers were on his back, basically, and all they wanted was exactly what you're saying, sort of filling in the gaps, and that, calling it pornography is basically saying it's cheap, it's lazy, it's uncreative, it's titillating in that it kind of, hits some kind of, base, quite sort of surface level need in a sense, but it's not doing anything deeper. And I would say, when I think about the idea of fan service, for me, things like, going to the mirror universe, bringing in Section 31. It's these kind of things that to me seem a little bit cheap, seem a bit kind of cheesy, that it does seem that has that kind of element of it to it. And again, some of my reservations about both the Kelvin films and Discovery would sort of tie into that. And particularly, I mean, this could be a whole other discussion about what happens with Section 31 and so on. To me, there's kind of a link between that and what Braga would call continuity pornography. But the other thing that occurred to me, when you were speaking, this idea of fans being unhappy and kind of complaining, is maybe we're thinking of it in terms of service that you get in a restaurant. Do you know what I mean? The kind of service that, the service wasn't good enough, I'm giving it a 1-star review. The waiter didn't do exactly what I wanted. The chef didn't cook my food how I was expecting. There's that other sort of meaning almost in that word, that we expect to be served in a certain way. And that kind of, again, is problematic because, like you say, art or TV or film or whatever is not a service industry in that sense. It's not, I mean, it is ultimately, obviously you produce something and you hope people like it. You hope you have readers or viewers or whatever it is and that they respond well to it. But it's not the same as someone comes into your restaurant for dinner. Do you know what I mean? It's a different model. And I think creative people, and actually, I was praising the actors on Discovery. I also think the writers of Discovery are very talented. I think often, certainly when I went back and rewatched season 1, my feeling was that individually, I thought there were lots of really beautifully written scenes. I thought there were lots of wonderful writing going on. It's just the kind of the bigger picture stuff for me that doesn't work with that show, really. It's the kind of big decisions. It's the decisions that take place. We saw in the DS9 documentary, the kind of famous writer's room of DS9 and the creativity that goes on in there. It's the kind of, there's that scene weirdly, in season 2 of Discovery where they're having the kind of conference discussion, sort of a la Next Gen. And Pike says there's no bad ideas. And then Giorgio says, how about we, nuke a whole planet or whatever? And everyone sort of stares at her and she says, what? I thought there were no bad ideas. It almost that to me is almost the Discovery writers' room. It's like that. Yeah, sometimes there are bad ideas, you know, and you need to exercise kind of judgment around them. Just because something seems like it sounds really exciting, and it sounds like it would be great, and everyone will get really excited about it. You need that kind of part of your brain that's thinking, well, but hang on, is it? Does it really make sense? And I know a lot of people have struggled with all the kind of business about the Red Angel and who's the Red Angel when, and now there are two of them and which one is doing which. And, does literally on a logical level, does that story? And I have no idea because I haven't gone back and rewatched it. And Chris Jones, the publisher of Trek FM, has watched it 6 times. And I don't think he's even 100% certain whether it makes logical sense or not. But the fact is, it certainly doesn't make logical sense on a level that you can appreciate on first viewing, and that ties up in any kind of easy way. And I do just think, I don't know, that to me is kind of where the problem comes in. It's the ideas that get stuck up on the board, and that maybe they were the wrong ideas to begin with. And then everything that follows, great scenes, but genuinely great, talented writers, brilliant directors, all the production values in the world, gorgeous to look at, wonderful actors doing a brilliant job. But it's the decisions that were taken, right back at the start that are the kind of problematic ones here. And I suppose the difference is, these anniversary shows or whatever. Okay, maybe Ira Stephen Bear hit a home run. Brannon Braga slightly fumbled it a couple of times. It doesn't really matter that much. I mean, these are the Voyages. Maybe it matters more because it's the last episode, and I think that's why it really annoyed a lot of people. But if that had just been an episode in a season of Enterprise, it would just be like, yeah, that was just a crap episode. There are plenty of crap episodes in Star Trek that, I mean, even something like Threshold, again, a bold idea.
Awfully executed.
Terrible. Yeah, but no, actually, I mean, maybe also an awful idea. I don't know, but certainly an unusual idea. It didn't work, but, so what? That's fine. But I suppose the danger is if it's a whole season of a show is so heavily tied into all this, then it kind of, it does start to take over. So it's like Control, infecting and kind of absorbing and gradually spreading its kind of tendrils through the rest of the story somehow.
This is where you've got to ask yourself, at what point does a project become about the service? At what point do you switch from being telling stories that are pushing some boundaries, even if they fail, and you move into wanting to do something because the fans will like it, and I think that's exactly what happened with Discovery. I think that was essentially what These Are the Voyages was about, because it means you get to see Riker and Troi again, and you're on the Enterprise D, and you can frame the Enterprise characters through the prism of people you're comfortable with, who you're excited to see again, even if it's, in this strange season 7 context, even though they look visibly 10 years older and it's really odd. But, even things like having Deanna Troi on Voyager, and having like whole episodes with Reg Barclay, set in back on Earth with Deanna Troi doing counselling with him and things like that. It's that kind of thing where you're trying to tap into if not nostalgia, then safety, into areas. And, I had a discussion with, it was brought up on the other podcast, but I had a discussion on the Babel conference with someone about Worf coming onto Deep Space Nine, and whether that was analogous to what they did with Spock in season 2 of Discovery. And I don't think it is, because I think one of the key things with Worf coming into DS9 in season 4 was that, yes, okay, it was to get Worf fans and Next Generation fans in. Of course it was. On a basic, pure level, yes, it was. But equally, Worf didn't become Deep Space Nine. He didn't. Deep Space Nine didn't then wrap itself around Worf and become the Worf show. Worf integrated into that show, and he became part of the tapestry of that, and arguably became a fantastic character because of DS9. Not really so much because of TNG. Deep Space Nine was the making of him, really. So you've got to look at it, and the difference with Spock is that, you talk about the origin story of Spock, because that's what it is, and that this is what fans have come to expect now from fiction. They've come to expect the origin story. You've seen it in all the Marvel films, you've seen it in, Zach compared it, I think, very accurately, the Spock shaving the beard thing, to the end of Casino Royale with the James Bond. The moment he becomes Bond, at the end of that film, You know, it's a similar sort of beat they try and play with Spock in that he becomes Spock, even though he's already Spock.
He was already Spock. We saw the cage. And
right, exactly.
Disco only makes sense if you... I don't mean it only makes sense, but like it plays massively on the fact that we've seen the cage and that we know that there was Spock in the cage. It's like...
Right.
So it's not an origin story in that sense.
No, but,
it's kind of...
They're trying to make... But they're trying to make it into the model of an origin story. They're trying to make it the moment Spock becomes Spock. You know, and it is cheap, as you say. It's cheap service because it's trying to con you almost into watching Discovery in order to have that beat of Spock. Like in the same way, you know, it's trying to fill the gaps of Pike's story. So, you know, we can see the track from the cage all the way through to the menagerie, even though we don't, because we don't actually see what happens to Pike. And I think we'll get a Captain Pike series where we do eventually anyway, you know, but it feels like it's all filling in those gaps. And, you know, you have to think, well, where does this kind of thing end? You know, and this is what they've got to be careful with the Picard show. I suspect it won't be quite as nakedly cynical as Discovery Season 2, but they've got to be careful they don't make it a big hagiography for Picard and make it all about, you know, how much of an amazing character he is. And you know, they've got to really do it. They've got to do something different. And I think, because it is that, again, is fan service. You know, Picard's back. Wow. And we're all excited for this. We are. Of course we are. Of course we are. It's Patrick Stewart. It's Jean-Luc Picard, who arguably didn't really have an ending to his story. And it's really exciting. It's quite thrilling as a fan to think we might see, you know, not just the late 24th century, but we might see Picard. So these are really exciting things. Well, at the end of Picard's story, I should say, or a new chapter of his life. But these are very fan servicey kind of things. It's very different. It's not like they've decided to set a new Star Trek series in, say, the 27th century with an entirely new crew, an entirely new dynamic. They're not doing things like that. They're trying to cheat and do that in Discovery in a way, but they are intentionally doing projects that are connecting to Trek you are safe, comfortable with, and you know you're going to be excited about. And it's a ploy that you're seeing across fiction. You're seeing it everywhere. You're seeing it in all these big old IPs. You're seeing it with Star Wars in how it, you know, that whole new trilogy has been all about tapping into the 1970s and 80s old movies. You're seeing it in James Bond, which is bringing back Blofeld and all these, you know, these old villains, you know, the Rami Malek as maybe Dr. No and all these hints that are going around about the new film. You're seeing it in all of these IPs, you know, and that is exactly what Star Trek has been doing. And it's a cross-fandom thing because they're worried that if you do something new, then your fandom are going to be angry. Your fandom are going to either react or they're going to say, this is not what we want. This is not, and they're worried that people will start watching. And it's, in a way, the creators have become at the mercy of fans. And that's really scary. You know, it's not how great art gets made. It's not how we ended up with The Inner Light. It's not how we ended up within the Pale Moonlight. You know, it's not how we ended up with, you know, great episodes of you know, Amok Time and all these kinds. It's not how we got to this. So if we want this, and this is my opinion, and it's a lot of people disagree, but we have not had one episode of Discovery which even comes close to those episodes I've just mentioned, not even in the same galaxy. And if we want that with this new Star Trek era, then they've got to stop servicing fans in the way they have been. And hopefully that needs to ripple across fandom in general, in everything. Because otherwise, we're not going to have anything to look back on one day.
And the interesting thing is, I suppose, when Next Gen debuted in the 80s, this was up in the air to some extent. And there was this kind of question mark about like, what's the relationship between Next Gen and the original series? And how much can we kind of lean on nostalgia for TOS and those characters and so on? And obviously we did have McCoy briefly in the pilot and so on. And we did have those other characters further down the line. But, you know, in those first few years of Next Gen, I remember there was reading about, and this was, I think, Ira Stephen Bear who was talking about, because he was working on Next Gen at the time when they were doing the episode Sarek. And there was this big row basically about whether they could use the word Spock in the episode Sarek, which is about, you know, is about a character from the original series and is about his father. But at the same time, that was for Next Gen, that was their way of like dipping their toe into the kind of continuity, into the kind of, you know, for want of a better word, fan service or whatever. I mean, I wouldn't think of the episode Sarek as a fan service episode. And that's partly because it's so dramatic and beautiful and heartbreaking and, really valid, interesting piece of work in its own right. And I think that that's maybe part of it. I mean, another episode that I was thinking of in DS9 is Blood Oath. Now, when I first watched DS9 and first watched Blood Oath, I hadn't seen I'd seen a few episodes of the original series, but I was not that familiar with the original series at all. I didn't realise those Klingons had come from the original series. That completely went over my head. But I loved that episode. I thought it was great. I thought they were three fantastic characters, really great actors, really interesting story, and I loved that story. And it's only later that I realised that was a kind of, again, one of these kind of little gifts to the fans or whatever. And DS9, I suppose, was the series that sort of lent into TOS a little bit more because the writers on that show, compared to Next Gen, where it was often these quite new, sort of new kind of professional writers who were kind of, this was their job and they were in the Next Gen universe and it was all about Next Gen. I think the DS9 writers did have more of this kind of nostalgia and affection for TOS and so on. And they did bring that in various kind of generally quite sort of small and subtle ways. But Blood Oath, I think, again, is a good example of a story that works very much on its own terms. It works as a piece of drama. It doesn't really matter whether you know all that stuff. I mean, Trials and Tribble-ations is different because it is obviously very much, the whole thing is about that love for the original series and is about that kind of nostalgia and about all that stuff. But again, it sort of does something with it, I suppose. And I guess it's interesting, talking about those, Trials and Tribble-ations and obviously Flashback we mentioned as well with these 30th anniversary things. I mean, we've also seen these kind of 50th anniversary things. There aren't many properties that get to 50 years, and there usually is some attempt to do that. So, I mean, I was talking about Doctor Who, the 50th, we had that episode where you got Matt Smith and David Tennant together, but you also got a cameo by Tom Baker. You also got all this other stuff that, even me as a not particularly a huge Doctor Who fan could recognize that was written by someone who, as we know, I mean, I know without even knowing much about Doctor Who, was a Doctor Who fan and wrote like fan fiction and stuff as a younger person and so on. And you could see the little references and the little kind of gestures and things were all in that. There is this kind of way of doing a kind of anniversary show, which is not like Trials and Tribble-ations, where they literally kind of, the whole story is about that original thing, but is like you do your own story, but at the same time, it's like an Easter egg hunt. It's not just you get one or two Easter eggs. It's like Easter egg, Easter egg, Easter egg. And you got that, I suppose, with Skyfall to some extent, which was the 50th anniversary Bond, I think, wasn't it? And you had all these little kind of references one way or another. And you got that to some extent, I think, with Beyond. I mean, maybe not to quite the same extent. And all the JJ films, have little references. 2009 has the reference to Archer's Beagle and so on. But Beyond, it was sort of peppering it a little bit more of that kind of stuff. And I didn't mind that. I sort of thought it worked fine, and it was a 50th anniversary, and we sort of know there's a kind of slightly cheeky, slightly cheesy sort of aspect to that, but it's quite sweet and good natured. But again, that was written by Simon Pegg, who genuinely loved Star Trek, and this was not a sort of cynical attempt to, like, I don't think, let's drop in as many of these Easter eggs as possible, and because that's what the fans will love. It was a little bit more, that must have been a conscious decision, but it was also a little bit more genuine than that. And some of them, that moment where the picture of the original series crew comes out, brings a lump to everyone's throat. I mean, that is kind of, or for me anyway, that was a very moving moment. And it shows that it is possible to hit those beats and do them in such a way that really celebrates fandom and celebrates the love that people can have for the property that they are a fan of. And I think this was true with the Doctor Who 50th as well, not speaking as a long-term huge Doctor Who fan or whatever, though I've watched a fair bit of Doctor Who over the years, sort of, kind of in passing, but that kind of genuine, heartfelt, kind of touching recognition that is kind of, that it is a genuine bridge between the creators and the fans, and a genuine link, and saying, yeah, this means something to us too, or this means something, we get the value of this in some way. But I think it doesn't always land like that. And, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But ultimately, I do think a lot of it comes down to who's the one making those gestures, and are they genuine or not? And who knows? I mean, maybe it's possible to be really cynical and really fake this stuff. But what it feels like to me is that sometimes I just don't buy it. I don't believe that the sentiment is genuine. I feel like it's a bit kind of cheap. And I have no idea. I mean, I don't know whether Alex Kurtzman genuinely loves Section 31 and has this kind of like, devoted interest in those episodes of DS9. Maybe he does, but like, I love DS9. I think, you know, as I said, DS9 seems to be the show that could do all this the best, because I think they had such kind of integrity in that writer's room and such creativity and so on. I've never felt that Section 31 is an element of Star Trek lore that means something to me in that way, that like I perk up at the very thought of it. But, you know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe for other people, they're like, wow, Section 31, that's the best thing about Star Trek. Or the Mirror Universe. Same for me, to be honest. I've enjoyed many of the Mirror Universe episodes. To me, the Mirror Universe is not really what screams Star Trek. The Mirror Universe is what screams kind of pulpy, Star Trek's gone a bit oddball this week. This is kind of, and the same with Section 31. It's the kind of, they're not really in the kind of sweet zone of what Star Trek represents to me. They're kind of slightly, they're the comic booky side. They're the sort of slightly kind of whatever. And so I suppose partly for me, that's what it often feels like. It feels a bit like, I don't know, again, it's a bit like Giorgio flashing that badge and, you know, that's supposed to sort of mean something. That's supposed to sort of impress Pike. It's that kind of like, hey, this is going to impress you. I don't know. I'm
sure a lot of people think that. And, you know, there is genuinely some element of, actually, and I was having this discussion recently, that maybe this isn't our Trek anymore, you know, and this is something that happens to a lot of people, a lot of different fandoms, you know, these properties have to move on, you know, and Star Trek has moved on, and I think there are, don't get me wrong, I mean, the Babel Conference is full of long-term legacy Star Trek fans who adore Discovery, so I'm really not suggesting that it's just newbies who love this. But I think there is sometimes for some of us that point where we have to sort of remember that this maybe isn't being made for us. And this, again, goes back to the fan service thing, but I think the difference with the difference between the two seasons of Discovery is that, you know, the elements of Discovery in season 1 that were tapping into elements and plugging gaps, like the Mirror Universe, you know, and like the Klingon Federation War, they were reflecting to some extent some of the allegorical stuff of the day. You know, the Klingon Federation War was, you know, in many ways a reflection of ISIS, you know, and fundamentalist terrorism, you know, under the guise of trying to create an empire around it. And then you've got, you know, the Mirror Universe, which is very much, you know, I mean, this is coming out at the end of 2017, start of 2018, at the, you know, after the first year of the Trump administration. It's very clearly a play on totalitarianism and, you know, the darkening impulses of our world, you know, and the fear that we might be edging more towards the Terran Empire than the Federation. And, you know, there is that element to it, even though it's very pulpy and B-movie and shooty and, you know, all that. But then season 2 of Discovery, I don't really think there's anything there except there's no depth. It's just surface. You know, I don't really see from that story and from that arc anything more than histrionics and pure, let's recreate the original series here. That's the difference. I think that's the fundamental difference between all these examples, you know, between the anniversary winks and nods. And like you say, the truly moving connections that are there and that creators can do, to something that is purely designed to, you know, give you what you want, to give you the confection, to make you go, oh wow, it's Spock. Oh, you know, like I said at the beginning, and it's that reaction that I think it really sucks you. It really sucks you in. And like I said, I had it when I saw the Enterprise. I had it, and it could have well have done the same with me. But I couldn't. I can't lie. I can't sit here and do what some of these actors and these writers are afraid not to do. I can't sit here and tell you honestly that I think this is good Star Trek, because I don't. And this is the reality. And I think you've got to be honest about that. And you've got to, and I think, and that's my opinion. And there are many, many people who disagree. But I think that the problem we've got now is that there are too many lines drawn between the two camps. And I think fan service is great up to a certain point. And I think then you've got to really, it's that whole thing of people don't really know what they want until it's there. you know? And I think the best kind of art, the best kind of writing, the best kind of movies, the best kind of TV gives people what they didn't realise they wanted. And I think if Star Trek starts to do that, then we're going to end up with something really exciting.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, no one thought they wanted Next Gen. Everyone thought that was a disaster, including Patrick Stewart, who didn't unpack his bag. I mean, everyone thought that was a cynical attempt to make the original series syndicate because they get some extra episodes or whatever, and it was a completely pointless, creatively pointless show. And it turned out, fortunately, in the end, they were wrong. But I think it's interesting what you say about this sense of honesty, and obviously the actors are in a difficult situation. The actors always have to say what they've been given is wonderful.
Of course they do.
Maybe they believe that. Maybe they got some good scenes. Maybe it seems quite dramatic. It is dramatic. They do play the kind of, they get stuff to do, if you know what I mean. So creatively, maybe it's quite fulfilling. But they can't really be going out like Gillian. I mean, Gillian Anderson can because she's got other things going on, and it was the last episode anyway, and she can, she clearly felt pretty pissed off about it, and she wanted to, and I would say justifiably, personally. But let's not get into a whole discussion about the X-Files. But I mean, I can see why she would do that, and she's in a position to do that I think the Discovery cast are not. I do think it's important though what you say about, being honest and saying, look, this doesn't work for me or whatever, and being prepared to say that. Because I guess again, when we're talking about, we were talking about the writer's room and the places that these decisions are being made, and I made that reference to Giorgio saying, I thought there were no bad ideas. Someone does need to be the one to put their hand up and say, actually, this thing doesn't make sense, or actually this thing is maybe not such a great idea when you think about it as it seems on the surface. And I think that is something that is difficult and is partly to do with the culture of a particular writer's room. And, maybe the DS, I mean, we do tend to really, sort of idealize this DS9 writer's room as having all these very talented, very brilliant people, and they've all gone on to do brilliant work as well, and so on. But I do think that is a part of it, is being willing to hear those kind of reservations and objections and so on. And I mean, my sort of dealings in the world of TV are very limited, but I have had, to a small extent, one of the books that I wrote was optioned for TV and went a certain way down the line. And we had these kind of meetings where writers were kind of, suggesting things and so on. And it did feel to me, even in that situation, there was sometimes there's a kind of sense that, like, particularly if you've got like a sort of star writer or a sort of, a writer who's really respected, no one will dare to put their hand up and say, actually, this just doesn't make sense, or actually there's a really serious problem with that. And that's what you need. You really need the script editor, and you really need a good script editor to put their hand up and say, yeah, sorry, that bit doesn't work. And that's why. Or, someone in the room who's willing to do that and who's willing to challenge it. And I do wonder whether partly, and this is complete guesswork on my part, but, with the new Star Trek that we've got with Alex Kurtzman, and I don't want to blame it all on him necessarily, but I think in some ways there is a danger that he is like a star writer, if you know what I mean, and a star kind of creative, and he's come from the movies and he's made, probably billions of dollars for various studios and so on. And he's the kind of person who I imagine if he says he wants to do something, no one is going to dare to say, we don't think that's such a great idea. And I do think you can see it sometimes in TV shows, even when you've got a really talented or really interesting writer, sometimes it all falls apart at the end, or there's something that goes wrong, and you just think, if the audience is all watching it saying, what the hell happened there? Or there's some massive logical flaw in this, or there's some huge, problem that hasn't been spotted. Why was there not someone in the room saying that at the time? Do you know what I mean? And I do think that is the kind of, that is the sort of the worry there. And the reason that a lot of this, when people talk about lazy writing, it's not necessarily that it's lazy. I mean, probably a lot of effort has gone into that writing. It's not that they've just written it in 5 minutes or whatever. It's just that there's been some mistake that crept in quite early that no one has bothered to, or no one has managed to sort of question. I mean, that sort of goes beyond the thing about fan service. It's more to do with the kind of whole writing culture generally. But I feel there's a kind of link there, maybe. The other thing I just wanted to ask you about, because I'm just curious, since we haven't really talked about it, what are your feelings? Because we talked about, seeing the Enterprise at the end of season 1 of Discovery and then going into season 2. What are your feelings on the 2-part mirror storyline in Enterprise, in A Mirror Darkly, because I know a lot of fans loved that episode and they loved seeing the old sets again and they loved all that nostalgia and all that stuff around it and they loved seeing the Mirror Universe and everyone loves the Mirror Universe. And I have to say, I've always hated those episodes. And I don't know whether that's just because like I take Star Trek far too seriously or like I just don't know how to have a good time or whatever it is. But I sort of feel like, to me, I was just like, I didn't want this. Do you know what I mean? I was kind of starting to like this show a bit more, and this did not make me. Again, it's just like, this is not what I now I sound like the terrible fan saying this is not what I ordered, but I suppose but what it is, the analogy there is almost being like brought like a special cake or something and being told that you ordered it when you didn't. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, you know, I never said I wanted this, you know, that was my feeling. But again, I know, you know, even more so than with Disco, most people that I know love those episodes, I think, and see them as a highlight of Enterprise. And I find that strange because I feel like they're the least Star Trek. They're the least kind of Enterprise-y in a way. They're kind of, to me, they're just a collection of gimmicks, but maybe people love the gimmicks,
but I think they do. I think they do love the gimmicks, and I think that's increasingly proven across fiction as a whole. Really, I think In A Mirror Darkly, I if I've seen it twice, I'd be, you know, that's it, you know, over the years. But yeah, I can't. And to be honest, it's been so long, I can't really remember a lot of the nuts and bolts of it. But obviously, it had the original Enterprise bridge, even though it was the, you know, the Defiant in that situation. But it has the repurposed Enterprise bridge, you know, and it's them trying in some respects to both do the original series sort of mirror episodes and play off the fact that Deep Space Nine did them, and you know, and it's in its own way, again, it's quite cynical. You know, it's actually trying to recapture some past glories. You know, and that fourth season of Enterprise was all full of either plugging gaps or recapturing some past glories or trying to, you know, give people answers to questions in the lore of Star Trek that you know, that existed. And I think that's where you can go. That's where you go wrong with this. You know, that is where, you know, fans. This is one of the reasons fan fiction exists, and this is one of the reasons why, you know, fans have the license. You know, not actual license to write them, if you see what I mean in that sense. But they have the liberty, shall I say, to write for fan fiction and, you know, do their own versions of these stories, because that's fine and that's great. And that's, you know, if you want to tell that story and you want to write that story and you want to put it on a website, then wonderful. And people may well enjoy it. But it's that whole difference of, you know, at what point is that meant for the masses? At what point should that become what the show is, or what the idea is, or what the film is? And I think, you know, something like In A Mirror Darkly was almost the forerunner to what we got with some of Discovery. It felt like it was Star Trek already trying to eat itself by that point, you know. And again, it goes back to that whole thing of how Enterprise ended up, even though, yeah, it had its moments, it ended up being a very discordant show, which never really figured out what it wanted to be completely, and then was abruptly, you know, cancelled. And I don't think necessarily Discovery will go down exactly the same path, but I don't think there'll be 7 seasons of Discovery. I really don't. And I think a lot will hinge on how successful this next season is and how successful this potential, you know, I mean, because it is essentially going to be a reboot in many ways. It's pushing the reboot button on much of the storyline, taking the characters that are left, and you can do anything. You know, that they literally could do anything now. And that is really exciting. But it's whether or not Discovery goes down the path of becoming DS9 or the Next Generation, where they really find their feet in season 3, or it becomes Enterprise and has a interesting, quite, you know, successful creatively third season, but it's too late, you know. And I think a lot will depend on what fans think of that. And like you said, I think they changed course, but based heavily on a lot of people who were unsatisfied with this and were saying, well, you know, give us something new, give us new worlds, get them exploring, get them out there. So I think fans have a lot of power now, and, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. And I don't think fans always have the responsibility, Duncan, to be honest, which is what worries me.
Well, that is a good point. I mean, I would say I don't feel as worried for Discovery as a show, I think, maybe as you do, because all the evidence seems to be people are watching it and people are enjoying it, and it seems to be, do you know what I mean? It seems to be performing well. So I suspect, we may see a massive drop off. It may be that, you know, they jump to the future and they lose that nostalgia thing and people start saying, what's this show about? And the fact is we don't really know what it's going to be about. I suppose the one thing it won't be about is plugging gaps, is doing that thing that you're talking about. And I think it's interesting when you think about season 4 of Enterprise, you're right. Season 4 of Enterprise is arguably like a season of, I see what you mean by calling it fan fiction. I mean, what I'd say is that I can see why people love that season though. And I don't think it is just because of that, because I think there's a lot of good writing in that season. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I suppose the thing about plugging gaps is on one level, it's always unnecessary. Like it's dramatically unnecessary because the gap was never a big problem in the first place. So you can do it in a way where it feels perfunctory and pointless, or you can do it in a way where you do something interesting creatively with it. I mean, arguably the Vulcan storyline in season 4 of Enterprise was again a sort of course correction. It was a way of kind of saying, so we've written these Vulcans, they're kind of arseholes in this show. In all the other Star Trek shows, they seemed quite, they were a bit annoying now and then, but they weren't like this. And then saying, okay, we have to sort of explain that. So we'll find a way of explaining that. And there's this reformation that goes on, and now they're going to become a bit more like the ones that we knew. So we've kind of almost sort of, a bit like we see with Discovery, kind of backpedaling and kind of and finding a way to like, okay, this is what happened to the spore drive, or this is what happened to this thing, or this is why this, thing doesn't quite match up to from the beginning. Now the Klingons do have hair. They just shaved their heads because they were at war, all this sort of thing. But I would say those episodes work dramatically. They're quite good episodes. I think there are lots of good stories in the 4th season that work on their own terms, even though they are also kind of plugging those gaps. But I think the danger is that when it becomes just about the plugging gaps, or when that sort of takes over the story, it becomes a problem. And just again, comparing, say, Enterprise and DS9, if you think about the whole issue about the Klingon foreheads, obviously Discovery has like really complicated this massively. The way that DS9 handled that was with a kind of a joke, a kind of meta joke in a sense, just Worf saying, oh, we don't talk about that, basically, and kind of acknowledging that there's a continuity issue because this is a franchise that at that point was 30 years old and things change. But in a way that does sort of make sense. I mean, it does sort of make on a basic level, it makes sense within universe. It's clear that it's a kind of meta joke on one level anyway. We have a laugh, we move on. It's not a big deal. We can cope with the fact that there's this difference. Enterprise takes it really literally and feels like it has to explain in some scientific, genetic way this seemingly, ridiculous, giving a sort of ridiculously complicated answer to a very simple question that actually everyone knows the real answer to anyway. And I just think it's kind of interesting. So that's the approach of very much like plugging the gap, tying up all the loose ends, filling it, making it all fit together, making it sort of make rational sense, but it doesn't make kind of creative sense, or it doesn't make kind of storytelling sense, or any kind of, it's all just about the kind of rational thing. And I suppose the other thing that strikes me about Trials and Tribble-ations, and one reason that's such a great episode, is actually it's not just about plugging gaps. That episode doesn't really, in a sense, it doesn't plug gaps in the Trouble with Tribbles. What it does is it quite cleverly layers a whole extra story on top of the story that we're already familiar with, to the extent that, you have that great thing where there's Sisko and Dax searching for the bomb up above Kirk's head in that scene where we know what's going on down below, but we've kind of imagined, and I suppose in some ways that is kind of fan fiction. That is sort of imagining what's going on down the corridor, or kind of, or on the other side of the door or whatever. But it kind of, I mean, it's a pretty flimsy story. It's a silly story, but at the same time, to me, it's quite, it doesn't feel quite so cheap somehow. Like it's layering this extra story in there that doesn't take anything away from the original story, and doesn't in itself is like a perfectly inoffensive story.
Do you know what else did that recently? Avengers Endgame. Have you seen it?
I haven't, no. But to be honest, I haven't seen an Avengers film since the first Avengers.
Well. So. Okay, well, spoilers in case you have...
two of them. I've seen Doctor Strange and I've seen Ant-Man, I think, and that might be about it since then.
Well, spoilers in case you haven't seen... Well, it's not massively a spoiler, but spoilers in case you haven't seen it, anyone. But in part of the plot of that is that the some of the characters go back in time to various different things, and one of the things they go back into is the first Avengers movie. So they are doing exactly what is in Trials and Tribble-ations, and that they're having to do something in the modern day, but they're interacting without their past versions of themselves, some of them knowing it, and to some extent it creates a new timeline off it in a way. It's a bit different, but ultimately there are moments where you're seeing moments from Avengers 2012, and the characters from 2019 are there watching that happen. So there is, and again, it fits. That whole film is very much similar kind of thing in terms of fan service, but without it feeling too cheap, with actually making it work for the story, and I think, and I won't go into any more of that just for people who haven't seen it, but it is something that I think you can do really well. But you've got to have a solid base to found that on. You've got to have something that is either flippant or something that, Endgame has its problems in terms of plotting in some extent, but in terms of the essence behind it and the meaning, there's quite a lot of goodwill in that, and it is the end of a story looking back. And I think, gimmicks and little things like that can work, but there's got to be a solid reason for it.
Weirdly, it kind of reminds me of way back, Darren Mooney and I recorded an episode about nostalgia in Voyager, and the extent to which Voyager is always like jumping back to previous episodes and kind of recreating those early seasons, later on down Voyager's run. You've got shows like the one where 7 and 9 is jumping through different time periods. You've got the one where Chakotay is kind of going back through different time periods and so on. It also reminds me of Back to the Future 2. I mean, everyone thinks of Back to the Future 2 as the film that's set in the future, but actually, a fair chunk of Back to the Future 2 is set in Back to the Future 1, isn't it? I think they go back to that.
I think so.
To the 1950s. Yeah. And he's literally going back into it again and going, this sort of other level of like almost going back into the first film again. And obviously that is a way of, there is a kind of fan servicey element of that, potentially, because it is, I think certainly with it plays up very much on this kind of nostalgic thing, and certainly Voyager, I think the further they got along with that series, into their kind of 7 seasons, the more nostalgic they got for kind of almost the show that they were not anymore. Do you know what I mean? And that you see this kind of desire to keep going back and keep looking back at the kind of early years of that show. I don't know whether that's so much about the fans, though. I always felt like that seemed to be some kind of compulsion on the part of the writers to go back there. I don't think it was, and maybe I'm wrong, but it never feels to me like they're saying, oh, the fans love to see Janeway with her bun of steel and they'll get such a thrill out of it. And, going, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that is what it was about. And it was just as kind of, calculated in a way, but it sort of feels like with Voyager, it's almost this kind of compulsion on the writer's part to just keep going backwards all the time, that they're supposed to be going, forwards to the Alpha Quadrant. With Discovery, we have got this interesting opportunity now to see what does this show take forward, and how does it, because it's going to be such a strong, the weird thing is, if they jumped at the end of the first season, it would have been one thing, but it's having had that second season in between that is going to be, I suppose when we look back on it, I mean, like I say, I don't think Discovery's, I don't see Discovery getting cancelled suddenly, in its prime. I think they may well have a plan for like 3 or 4 years or something, and that's what it's going to be. But as I say, it seems to be pretty popular and doing pretty well. So I don't worry that they're going to just be sort of, meet an untimely end necessarily. But I do wonder when we look back on it, and I said this a while ago when I was doing this panel in Guernsey, we were talking quite a lot about Discovery, and I was sort of saying, I feel like I don't yet know what the show is that it's trying to become. And maybe at some point we're going to, when Discovery's over and we can see the whole thing, assuming that it has developed a clear identity of some kind, we'll be able to look back and say, okay, these were the steps along the way, and now we sort of see where it was going. I wonder, is season 2 going to be the aberration? And we're just going to think, wow, that was a weird experiment. And that was a kind of, this sort of nostalgia fest that almost came out of nowhere, because you're right, it's baked into the premise, but that was kind of atypical. Or is each season, I mean, every season of Discovery they have a new captain. Is every season going to be basically a different show? We're not getting the anthology insofar as an anthology of where that, like, time and place and so on. Maybe we're getting an anthology of tone almost, where
maybe
each season is just like, it is almost like it's been created by a different person, you know, a bit like sometimes with a franchise, with franchise films, you get a different director coming in each time and kind of shaking things up and making it feel, you know, not feeling like the same thing continuing, but actually feeling like, okay, this is a different take on this story. Who knows? Time will tell. One day, you know, Star Trek 20, 30, 50 years down the line will be nostalgically harking back to Discovery and you know, reimagining themselves in the middle of Captain Pike's tenure of the Discovery. People will be, you know, future Starfleet crews will be sending themselves back there. Who knows?
I do hope so. And I hope we enter a new phase for this. And, you know, I really do. I sound like I am really down on it all, and that I'm very curmudgeonly and miserable about it. And, you know, I'm not even trying to denigrate fan fiction. You know, I've written fan fiction. I enjoy it. You know, and there are things about Discovery that I do like, but I just think that a lot of it is being driven by fan service for the wrong reasons. And I think if they can get away from that, and I think if we can get away from that as a fandom, then I think we'll end up with something so much richer. And then I can stop being miserable about it. From my own personal perspective, I'll sound like a broken record.
If nothing else, that's something to look forward to.
Yeah.
That's a hopeful, optimistic note to end on, I think. Before we go, Tony, do you want to tell our listeners where they can track you down online if they want to get in touch and tell you why you're wrong, or read some of your more lengthy musings on these subjects and take a look at your blog and so on? What's the best way for them to find you?
Well, yeah. If you want to be more depressed by me, follow me on Twitter at AJBlackWriter. My website is theculturalconversation.com, where I'm writing about Star Trek and various other different things in pop culture. But yeah, that's where I am. And, you know, there is some Discovery stuff on there, but if you go into it with an open mind, it's not all having a go at Discovery. Now, I do write positive Star Trek stuff as well sometimes.
Well, it's been fun talking about fan service, the good, the bad, the ugly this week. But that's not all we've been doing on Trek FM. So have a listen to what else you might have missed out on elsewhere on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Orb.
I'm not sure that our mindset has necessarily changed drastically from 1993 to 2019. Perhaps it has. I think it has a bit. But the tendency for this kind of thing to happen may have been there then, but the difference is that today we have these platforms like Twitter and Facebook that amplify it, and it is much easier for people to get together into these groups and push a certain agenda or attack an individual.
Melodic Treks.
But I did actually look back to a lot of the older stuff, like the Jerry Goldsmith scores and even like the James Horner scores. I thought the orchestration style, like, I thought was really, really cool to me. Kind of had this more classical, like using only the orchestra, but creating these spooky textures and stuff. I always really loved that kind of sound.
Literary Treks.
And all of a sudden, we see a panel that shows where Kirk and Crisp are. I want to call her Crispy for a second.
There's Spock and Crisp, I think, right?
Okay, yeah, Spock and Crisp. I love that cereal. And I had some Kellogg's Spock and Crisp the other day.
Warp 5.
You don't give them the tools they need moving forward. It's great to give someone their freedom, but you have to then stay there and help them to get to the next step so that they don't need you anymore to do that. That was the problem with the episode. And I think that plays a big role in not just this episode, but society in general. We've done that a lot in other countries, and we've gone and knocked out regimes and, you know, whatever. And then we don't do anything for the people there. So we're back in the same boat or a worse boat than we were when we started.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published.
And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place is to join the larger conversation on the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type in Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up.
If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture. That'll come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
Primitive Culture is brought to you by Duncan Barrett and Clara Cook. You can find Duncan Barrett on Twitter at Barrett's Books. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC.
If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details.
Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us, and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM.
We'd like to take this opportunity to thank our associate producers here at Primitive Culture, Tony Black and Amy Nelson. Tony was one of the founders of this show, and we still keep him in the loop about what we're doing. You can find him on Twitter at @AJBlackWriter, and online hosting about a dozen other podcasts on everything from The X-Files to classic cinema. Amy is the host of 2 shows on the Trek FM network, Earl Grey and The Edge, and you can find her online on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson.
You're blended, all right.